never something I thought I'd do for long. I started when I was 15, mostly watching neighborhood kids for some extra cash. Over time, the occasional gig turned into a regular job, and by the time I was in college, it was how I paid my rent. It always seemed like easy money. Watch TV with the kids, put them to bed, and do homework until the parents returned. But the Callaway job made me realize how naive I had been. That night changed everything. The Callaways were new in town. They'd moved into one of those old Victorian houses that seemed out of place in our modern suburb. Mrs. Callaway called one evening, asking if I was free to watch her two kids, Abby, 8, and Tommy, 5. I had seen the family around town but never spoken to them. There was something off about the way Mrs. Callaway spoke on the phone. Her voice was too calm, almost like she was trying to hide something, perhaps fear or anxiety. But I brushed it off. I needed the money, and she was offering double my usual rate. The night of the job, I pulled up to their house just after dusk. The Victorian mansion loomed over me, its dark windows like staring eyes. The peeling paint and overgrown lawn contrasted starkly with the pristine homes around it. I tried to shake off the unease as I walked up the stone path to the front door. Mrs. Callaway answered almost immediately after I rang the bell. She was in her late 30s, with dark circles under her eyes and a nervous smile that didn't quite reach them. "Thank you so much for coming on such short notice," she said, ushering me in. "We really appreciate it." "No problem," I replied, forcing a smile. Happy to help. The inside of the house was even more unsettling. The air was thick, almost musty, and the dim lighting only added to the eerie atmosphere. The decor was a mix of antique furniture and strange old portraits that seemed to watch me as I walked through the foyer. "Abby and Tommy are in the living room," Mrs. Callaway said, leading me down a narrow hallway. "They've already had dinner, so you just need to make sure they get to bed by 9. They're good kids, but sometimes..." Her voice trailed off, leaving an uneasy silence. I nodded, trying to ignore the prickling feeling on the back of my neck, and followed her into the living room. Abby and Tommy were sitting on the couch, watching an old black and white cartoon on TV. "Hi, guys," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "I'm Sarah. I'll be watching you tonight." Abby looked up at me with wide brown eyes and gave me a small smile. Tommy, on the other hand, seemed entirely engrossed in the TV, not even glancing in my direction. Mrs. Callaway glanced at her watch. "We should be back by midnight. If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. We do have a landline, right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Something about her earlier tone had unsettled me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "Yes," she replied quickly, almost too quickly. "Just be careful. Sometimes the kids talk about things. Imaginary friends, you know, but it's nothing, really. Just be careful." Before I could ask what she meant, she was out the door, leaving me alone with Abby and Tommy. The first hour passed uneventfully. Abby was chatty, telling me all about her new school and how much she loved art class. Tommy remained quiet, barely looking up from the TV. I figured he was just shy, but there was something about the way he sat there, so still, that made me uneasy. By 8:30, I decided it was time to start getting them ready for bed. "All right, guys," I said, standing up. "Let's get you into your pajamas." Abby hopped off the couch and ran upstairs to change, but Tommy didn't move. "Tommy," I said, kneeling down next to him, "do you want to go get your pajamas on?" He finally looked at me, his eyes dark and hollow. "He doesn't want me to go upstairs," he whispered. A chill ran down my spine. "Who doesn't want you to go upstairs, Tommy?" He didn't answer, just turned back to the TV. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "It's okay, Tommy," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's no one here but us." But he didn't budge. I stood up, feeling increasingly uneasy, and went upstairs to check on Abby. I found her in her room, already in her pajamas, brushing her hair in front of the mirror. "Abby, do you know why Tommy doesn't want to go upstairs?" I asked. She shrugged, not looking away from the mirror. "He says there's a man up here." "What kind of man?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "I don't know," she said, finally turning to face me. "But sometimes I hear him too, late at night when it's really quiet." My heart sank. "What does he sound like?" Abby hesitated. "He whispers. I can't understand what he's saying, but it's scary. Mommy and Daddy don't believe me, though I tried to keep my face neutral. But inside, I was freaking out." "Well, there's no man here now," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's just us. Why don't you get into bed, and I'll read you a story." Abby nodded and climbed into bed. I tucked her in and grabbed a book from the shelf, trying to ignore the gnawing unease as I started reading. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. After I finished the story, I kissed Abby on the forehead and turned off the light. "Good night, sweetie. Good night, Sarah," she murmured. Already half asleep, I closed the door softly and made my way back downstairs, my nerves on edge. Tommy was still on the couch, but now he was lying down, staring up at the ceiling. "Tommy, it's time for bed," I said gently. He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "He'll come for me if I go upstairs." My heart pounded in my chest. "Tommy, there's no one upstairs, I promise. I just checked, and it's all safe." He sat up, tears welling in his eyes. "Please don't make me go up there, Sarah, please." I didn't know how much time passed before I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the old pipes, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Sarah." My blood ran cold. It wasn't coming from the TV, and it wasn't Tommy. It was coming from the hallway. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Tommy, but he was already staring at the hallway, his face pale with fear. "It's him," he whispered back. I stood up, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to grab the kids and run, but I couldn't just abandon them. I took a deep breath and walked toward the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing. I reached the foot of the stairs and stopped, staring up into the darkness. The whisper had come from up there. I was sure of it. "Sarah." This time, the voice was clear, more insistent. It was coming from Abby's room. My legs felt like lead as I climbed the stairs, each step echoing in the silent house. When I reached the top, I saw that Abby's door was slightly ajar, a faint flickering light coming from inside. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. Abby was sitting up in bed, staring at the corner of the room where a shadowy figure stood, barely visible in the dim light. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching us. "Sarah, help me," Abby whispered, her voice trembling with fear. I wanted to move, to grab her and run, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing the distance between us in an instant. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. Abby screamed, and I felt a cold, clammy hand brush against my arm. "Tommy!" I yelled, but the living room was empty. He was gone. "Sarah, please don't leave me." Abby sobbed, clinging to me. "I won't, I promise," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But inside, I was terrified. We huddled together in the corner of the living room, the whisper swirling around us. Relentless. I fumbled for my phone, my hands shaking, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The house was silent as silent. I could feel the darkness pressing in on us, suffocating us. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the stairs. I held my breath, praying that it was Tommy, that this was all just a nightmare. But it wasn't Tommy. It was the figure, taller now, more solid, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, staring at us with a malevolent grin. "Sarah," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure began to advance, its grin widening, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. And then, just as it reached us, the front door burst open, and Mrs. Callaway rushed in, her face pale with terror. "Get away from them," she screamed, holding up a small ornate cross. The figure hissed, recoiling from the cross, its form flickering like a dying flame. It let out a bone-chilling scream and dissolved into the darkness, leaving the room in an eerie, oppressive silence. Mrs. Callaway rushed over to us, pulling Abby into her arms, her face wet with tears. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I should have told you. I should have warned you." I was too shaken to speak, too terrified to ask what she meant. All I knew was that I needed to get out of that house, to leave and never come back. But as I stood up, I realized something was wrong. Tommy was still missing. "Where's Tommy?" I demanded, panic rising in my chest. Mrs. Callaway's face went white. I don't know. We searched the house from top to bottom, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. It was like he had vanished into thin air. As the hours dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive, that it had taken Tommy, and that it was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike again. When the police finally arrived, They searched the house but didn't find anything, no sign of Tommy, no evidence of anyone else being in the house. They tried to reassure us, telling us that it was probably just a prank, that Tommy would turn up soon, but I knew better. I knew that whatever was in that house was not of this world, and that it had taken Tommy somewhere we could never reach him. As I drove home that night, I couldn't stop shaking. I kept seeing that figure in my mind, its eyes burning with malice, its voice whispering my name. I never went back to the Callaway House. I couldn't, but I couldn't forget either. I couldn't forget the fear in Tommy's eyes, the way he had begged me not to make him go upstairs. And I couldn't forget the whispers, the way they had seemed to wrap around me, suffocating me, pulling me into the darkness. The nightmare started soon after. Every night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the whispers echoing in my ears. And every night, I'd hear it again. That voice, so close, so real. Sarah, I don't know how much longer I can take this. I don't know how to make it stop. All I know is that something is coming for me, something I can't escape. And I'm afraid that one night, I won't wake up. The nightmares weren't just dreams, they felt like premonitions, warnings that I couldn't ignore. The voice that whispered my name, the shadows that moved just out of sight, the cold sensation that crept up my spine as I lay in bed at night, they were all becoming more real with each passing day. I tried to forget what had happened at the Callaway House, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Tommy's terrified face, heard the hissing whisper of that thing in the dark. I stopped taking babysitting jobs, too scared to be alone with other people's children, too scared to be in any house other than my own. But even in the safety of my home, I felt like I was being watched. The darkness in my room seemed to press in on me at night, and I started keeping the lights on when I slept. My parents noticed, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened. How could I explain that I was being haunted by something I didn't even understand? Days turned into weeks, and the tension in my life grew unbearable. I started seeing things, flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows that didn't belong to anything, reflections in the mirror that weren't mine. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. It all came to a head one night when I woke up to the sound of someone crying. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, a child, sobbing, muffled and distant. "Tommy?" I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling, but there was no answer, just the soft, pitiful sound of crying. I knew it was insane, but I had to know where it was coming from. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The crying seemed to be coming from downstairs, in the basement. My stomach turned with fear, but I forced myself out of bed. I had to know. I had to find out if it was real, or if I was just losing my grip on reality. I crept out of my room and down the hallway, the sound growing louder with each step. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I had never liked the basement. There was something about it that always gave me the creeps, even when I was a kid. But now, it felt like the heart of all my nightmares. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The crying was louder now, echoing up from the darkness below. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight tighter, shining it down the stairs. "Tommy?" I called again, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. Just the crying, growing more desperate, more anguished. I forced myself to take a step down the stairs, then another, until I was descending into the cold, damp basement. The light from my phone barely cut through the thick darkness, but I kept moving forward, drawn by the sound of the crying. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, the crying stopped suddenly, plunging the basement into an eerie silence. I swung the flashlight around, the beam flickering as it passed over the cluttered shelves and boxes. But there was nothing there, no sign of anyone, no sign of anything out of place. My breath caught in my throat as I slowly turned in a circle, scanning the basement. "Hello," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear. And then I saw it, a figure, standing in the far corner of the basement, just out of the flashlight's reach. It was tall and shadowy, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. My heart leapt into my throat as I took a step back, my entire body shaking. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice wavering. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching me, with an intensity that I could feel even through the darkness. "I'm not afraid of you," I lied, my voice quivering. The figure began to move, slowly gliding toward me, its shape shifting and flickering in the dim light. I backed up, my legs trembling, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. "Leave me alone," I screamed, but the figure kept coming, growing more solid, more real with each passing second. And then, Just as it reached me, the light from my phone flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, the silence so thick it was suffocating. Suddenly, a cold, clammy hand grabbed my arm, and I screamed, jerking away from it. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall hard, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel something there with me in the darkness, something that was drawing closer with every passing second. I fumbled with my phone, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but my fingers were shaking too badly. My heart was racing, and I could feel the walls closing in on me. I was trapped, with no way out, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the coldness receded, and the oppressive darkness lifted. The light from my phone flickered back on, revealing the basement empty once again. The figure was gone, and so was the crying. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move, too scared to breathe. But nothing happened. The basement remained still, silent, as if nothing had happened at all. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on my bed, clutching my phone, my mind racing. I didn't understand what was happening to me, but I knew one thing for sure: something was wrong, something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I needed help, and I needed answers. I called up my friend Jenna, someone I trusted more than anyone else, and asked if we could meet up. I didn't want to talk about this over the phone. We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place that was always filled with people and light. It made me feel a little safer just being around others. Jenna arrived a few minutes later, looking concerned as she sat down across from me. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she said, her voice soft with worrying. "I haven't," I admitted, my hands trembling as I wrapped them around my coffee mug. "I've been having these experiences. I don't know how to explain it. Try me," Jenna said, leaning in closer. I took a deep breath and started from the beginning, telling her everything that had happened since that night at the Callaway House: the voice, the nightmares, the shadows, and finally, the encounter in the basement. By the time I finished, Jenna's face had gone pale, her expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "This is, I don't know, Sarah. It sounds like something out of a horror movie," she said, her voice shaking. "I know how it sounds," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's real, Jenna. I can feel it. Something is after me." Jenna was silent for a moment, her eyes searching mine. Do you think it has something to do with Tommy?" I hadn't considered that, but the moment she said it, it made sense. "Maybe, but I don't know how or why. Maybe you should talk to someone," Jenna suggested, her voice hesitant. "Like a psychic or a paranormal expert." I almost laughed at the suggestion, but then I realized I had no better ideas. "Do you really think that could help?" "It can't hurt to try," Jenna said, her tone more serious now. "If there's something supernatural going on, you need someone who knows how to deal with it." As much as I hated to admit it, she was right. I was out of my depth here, and I needed help. Jenna offered to find someone reputable, and within a few hours, she texted me the name and number of a woman who came highly recommended, a psychic named Evelyn. I was skeptical, but I was also desperate. I called Evelyn and explained my situation, half expecting her to laugh at me or dismiss me as crazy. But she didn't. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she agreed to come to my house the next evening. The hours leading up to her visit were agonizing. I felt like I was being watched constantly, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I kept the lights on in every room, but it didn't make me feel any safer. When Evelyn finally arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, with long gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. She carried a small bag filled with various items that I didn't recognize: candles, crystals, and other tools of her trade. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice trembling. "Of course," she replied, her voice calm and soothing. "Let's see what we're dealing with, shall we?" Evelyn walked through the house, her expression growing more serious with each step. She paused in the hallway, her eyes narrowing as she looked up the stairs. "There's a lot of energy here," she said, her voice thoughtful. "Dark energy. Whatever happened in this house, it left a mark." I swallowed hard. "Can you help me?" "I'll do my best," Evelyn replied, but there was a note of uncertainty in her voice that made my stomach churn. We went down to the basement together, the place where I had felt the presence most strongly. Evelyn set up a small altar on one of the shelves, lighting candles and placing crystals around the space. She muttered a few words under her breath, words that I didn't understand. And then she turned to me, I'm going to try to communicate with whatever is here, she said. But you need to stay close to me. Don't wander off, no matter what you see or hear. Do you understand? I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I was on the verge of something terrible, something I might not be able to come back from. Evelyn closed her eyes and began to chant softly, her voice filling the basement with a strange, hypnotic rhythm. The air around us seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. And then, without warning, the temperature dropped, and the basement was plunged into darkness. The candles flickered and went out, leaving us in pitch blackness. Evelyn, I whispered, my voice shaking. Stay close to me, she replied, her voice calm but strained. I could feel something moving in the darkness, something cold and malevolent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Suddenly, I heard the whisper again, louder this time, more insistent, Sarah. I gasped, backing up against the wall, my heart racing. What is that? It's trying to reach you, Evelyn said, her voice tense. Whatever it is, it's drawn to you. It's using your fear to grow stronger. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know, Evelyn admitted, but we need to find out. The darkness seemed to press in on us from all sides, and I could hear the sound of something moving, something slithering across the floor. I grabbed Evelyn's arm, my fear mounting with each passing second. Sarah, the voice hissed again, closer this time. Show yourself, Evelyn commanded, her voice strong and authoritative. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath in the air. The darkness seemed to pulse around us, and then, slowly, a figure began to materialize in the corner of the basement. It was the same figure I had seen before, tall and shadowy, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Evelyn held up her hands, chanting louder now, her voice filled with power. The figure recoiled, hissing in anger, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to advance, its form growing more solid, more menacing. Sarah, come to me, the voice whispered, and I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me toward the figure. No, Evelyn shouted, grabbing my arm. Don't listen to it. Stay with me. The darkness seemed to pulse with life, closing in around us. I could feel the figure's eyes on me, cold and calculating. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy, as if I were being pulled into a dream. Suddenly, a blinding light filled the room, breaking the hold the figure had on me. Evelyn's chanting reached a crescendo, her voice cutting through the oppressive darkness like a blade. The figure let out a piercing scream, its form twisting and contorting as it was forced back into the shadows. As the light faded, the basement returned to its previous state, cold, dark, and silent. Evelyn slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. It's gone, she said, her voice weak. I could hardly believe it. The overwhelming presence, the terrifying figure, it was all gone, but the experience left me shaken, and the memory of that night would stay with me forever. After that night, I stopped babysitting altogether. The terror I had experienced left a lasting scar, and I couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot in another house alone. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But one thing is clear, I will never forget the night of the Callaway House, the night when my life changed.